Thank you very much. May I ask everyone to please join me in Gassho? Namo Amidabutsu. Namo Amidabutsu. Namo Amidabutsu. Namanda, namanda, namanda. I'd like to thank Reverend Hirano and everyone at the CBE for inviting me to be a part of today's session as well. And I'd like to thank all of you who came back after having to endure session one. But I'm glad that you did. This is a topic which is very important to all of us in Shin Buddhism. That's the topic of Shinjin. And as we mentioned before, it's one that's not talked about all that much for perhaps a number of reasons. But it's extremely important. So I'd like to continue on with the talk, and so I'm going to now share my screen. We'll begin once again by reading from the words of the largest sutra of the Buddha of Immeasurable Life, as rendered by Shinran Shonin. Please join me once again in Gassho. All sentient beings, as they hear the name, realize even one thought moment of Xinjin and joy, which is directed to them from Amida's sincere mind, and aspiring to be born in that land, they then attain birth and dwell in the stage of non-retrogression. Namo Amidabutsu, Namo Amidabutsu, Namo Amidabutsu, Namanda. We begin today's session with that reading because it's so vital and so central to Shinran's understanding and appreciation of Xinjin. Oh, I guess I do this now. Okay. So during last week's session, we learned that Xinjin, in Shinran's thought, evokes a broad range of religious meaning. It's a simple faith in Amida Buddha's vow. It's also an ever-deepening experience of awakening. And Shinran also mentions it's none other than the Buddhist mind itself. We note, however, that while Shinran describes Xinjin in great detail and in many ways, he never tells us how we can realize Xinjin. And I think for many of us, myself included, his failure to do so is frustrating, to say the least, perhaps even maddening, because that's exactly the thing we want to know. How do we realize Xinjin? However, as we reflect upon this, we understand that Shinran never would nor ever could prescribe a way for us to attain Xinjin. Because what if he were to do that? What if he were to suggest that there is a method, there's a process, or there's a way that would lead us to realize Xinjin, and he was going to tell us? Well, I'm just speculating here, but it seems to me that knowing human beings the way we are, many of us, we would wield that process as a kind of sword, as I mentioned here, forged out of our own desires and designs, that promotes our own values, biases, and claims to spiritual standing. That is to say, we might say, well, I know the way to realize Xinjin. I've got Xinjin. Do you? Do you want me to help you? Do you want me to tell you how? Or my Xinjin is better than that person's. As a teacher might say, you should follow me because my path to Xinjin is more authentic than that person's. And so we might wield that process, that idea. We'd apply our own calculation, apply our own designs, our own minds of self-power to create something of our own making or of our own usage, which is far from being the Xinjin that Shinran talks about. On the other hand, we also might cling to that method as a shield that would protect our egos from critical self-scrutiny. If we think, oh, I've got a formula for attaining Xinjin, I just have to follow that, do A, B, C, and D, get Xinjin. But what falls out of that equation or that formula is the deep and unrelenting self-scrutiny that is vital to the Xinjin experience. And so, of course, Shinran would not tell us how to realize Xinjin. It makes perfect sense that he wouldn't. But what he does do is he informs us that Xinjin arises. So now we'd like to talk about this topic of the arising of Xinjin. As I mentioned before, Shinran's perspective on Xinjin, as well as the arising of Xinjin, can be seen in his very unique understanding of the passage on the fulfillment of the primal vow in the largest sutra, which we just read together. This is the one we just read. Let me move on, if I could. say that for Shinran, the arising of Shinjin comes about when sentient beings hear the name of Amida Buddha, that is the act of Mommyo. Truly hearing the calling of Namo Amidabutsu is itself the arising of Shinjin. This is Shinran's understanding. We draw from a very important passage. This is probably the most well-known passage in which Shinran comments on that passage that we just read. I'll just read the first part of it. It's rather long. Shinran says, the word hear, okay, when sentient beings having heard the name, hear in the passage from the largest sutra means that sentient beings having heard how the Buddha's vow arose, its origin and fulfillment, are altogether free of doubt. This is to hear. Shinjin is Shinjin that is directed to beings through the power of the primal vow. This passage goes on, and it's a very, very vital passage. It's very, very important, but it's really packed with all sorts of good stuff. We're just not going to have time to cover all of that today, so I'm just going to stop right here in reading this passage, but I encourage you to go on and read the entire passage when you can. So what is Shinran saying here? He's saying hearing the name is none other than Shinjin itself. When that occurs, sentient beings hear how the Buddha's vow arose, its origin and fulfillment, and are altogether free of doubt. What does origin and fulfillment of the Buddha's vow mean? Well, perhaps it's a reference to what I say in quotation, the historical content of great Shinjin. But by putting the word historical in quotations, I actually mean it's not historical. Not historical in the sense that we are aware of history, the flow of history from past, present to future. It's not historical in that sort of sense. In fact, the history of Xinjin, or the history of the vow, I guess is a better way of saying it, is actually, it's an ahistorical history. It's history beyond history, history that predates history, a history that's always prior to us, always original, always earlier than us. And so this sense of history is a religious history. It may be a mythical history, if you want to use that term. So what are the elements or aspects of that historical content of great Shinjin? The first element is that sentient beings are filled with deluded passions and lack the true heart and mind, known in Japanese as kimu. Dharmakaya Bodhisattva, perceiving this, establishes the vows, performs the practices, and attains all virtues which bring about being's liberation, known as enjo. And finally, Amida Buddha gives the mind of true Shinjin to sentient beings, esse, who awaken to this reality and are without doubt. So these are the three maybe elements, we might say, the aspects of this historical content of Shinjin, the historical development of the vow. So hearing as Shinjin has this sense of, it's a noetic content. That is, we can truly know, we can realize the truth and reality of the vow, the functioning, the operation of the primal vow of Amida Buddha. Shinran throughout his works is very careful. He uses words carefully. He's really meticulous in his use of language. And throughout his works, he uses expressions such as monshiste, to hear and reflect, or shinchisu, one truly knows. So as the sense of hearing also has a sense of knowing, of reflecting, and trusting also has a sense of knowing. So this is really important as we understand what Shinran is getting at when he's talking about hear the name. On the other hand, Shinjin is hearing the name. It points to something more than just listening to the Dharma, which is extremely important. But more than that, more than just listening to the Dharma and believing in it. It's more than some kind of dualistic intellectual activity. Rather, I think what Shinran is getting at when he talks about hearing the name, it might be seen as a person's direct encounter with the Buddha's wisdom unfolding as compassion, which brings about the awakening of trust, realization, and freedom of doubt. So it's a direct encounter with wisdom, compassion. Shinran talks about the name in a variety of ways. when he says that the name of the Buddha is not just Amida Buddha. We often think that Amida Buddha's name is Amida Buddha. For Shinran, he says the sacred name is Namo Amidabutsu. Okay, Namo Amidabutsu is the name, is the myogo. Namo Amidabutsu, Shinran says elsewhere, is the Buddha's voice that calls to us. As he says in the chapter on practice, Namu means to take refuge, Kimyo. Kimyo is the command of the primal vow, calling to and summoning us. Isn't that interesting? So Namo Amidabutsu, the Namu is Kimyo, to take refuge. And this, he says, is the command of the primal vow, the calling of the primal vow, calling us, summoning us to come forward just as we are. But he also says it's our response to that call. As he says in another text, Notes on the Inscriptions on Sacred Scrolls, Namu means to take refuge. To take refuge is to respond to the command and follow the call of the two honored ones, Shakyamuni and Amida. So Namo Amidabutsu is many things. It is in itself the name of Amida Buddha, the name of the Buddha. But it also means this. It is, Namu means the Buddha is calling to us, summoning us to come to the Pure Land, to come just as we are. And it's our response to that call, Namo Amidabutsu, saying, we will follow, I will follow that command. I will follow that call. So it's a very multi-layered, very sort of subtle approach to the notion of name. And so with that in mind, then, Shinran says, true and in this way, true and real Shinjin, which is, he says, directed to beings through the power of the primal vow, it arises. Shinjin arises. It awakens within beings. And this true and real mind, he says, is completely untainted by the hindrance of doubt. As he says in this text, Notes on One's Calling and Many Calling, hear the name is to hear the name that embodies the primal vow. Hear means to hear the primal vow and be free of doubt. Further, it indicates Shinjin. So we hear Amida Buddha's name, Namo Amidabutsu, the Buddha's vow mind that calls to us to entrust in it. And we respond to it without harboring any doubt. Now, doubt here also has a number of levels of meaning, and that's important to also understand. Doubt is not simply a sense that we have uncertainty or questions about a thing, about a, I doubt a person, or I doubt a teaching, or I doubt an idea, or I doubt what you say. It's not simply that kind of doubt. Doubt also means that that it describes us as we are devoid of clear wisdom and unable to see things clearly. That's also doubt. So it's a sort of intellectual, cognitive doubt, but it's also a much deeper doubt. It's that we are devoid of wisdom. That doubt is a representation of a very fundamental ignorance. We're unable to see things clearly or think clearly. And so to be free of doubt means that we're able to know ourselves just as we truly are, and thus entrust ourselves completely to Amida's vow. And what does that mean? Shinran gives us some help when he cites a very important verse by the Pure Land Master Shandao of China. Shandao explains the meaning of Jinshin, or deep mind, from the Contemplation Sutra. And he does so in a couple of ways. This is one way in which he presents it in his text called Hymns of Birth, Ojo Raisan. And for Shinran, this reveals the dynamic core of Shinjin itself. Let me read it to you. Deep mind is true and real Shinjin. One truly knows oneself to be a foolish being, full of blind passions, with scant roots of good, transmigrating in the three realms and unable to emerge from this burning house. Very dramatic language. And further, one truly knows now, without so much as a single thought of doubt, that Amida's universal primal vow decisively enables all to attain birth, including those who say the name even down to 10 times or even but hear it. Hence it is called deep mind. Once again, this is one version of Shandao's explanation of deep mind. There'll be another one that we'll come across later in today's session. So what Shinran is getting at is this: we awaken within the unfolding of wisdom as compassion to the reality that we are simply Bombu, ordinary, foolish beings. Here's a passage that I'd like to read to you. Some of you have probably heard it. It's a tough one to read, and it's a tough one to listen to. It's a tough one to think about. He says this, foolish beings, bombu, none other than ourselves. So when we use this word, he's talking about us. It's not about someone else. It's not about those people. It's not about those people who, look different from us or think different from us. It's not those people on the other side of the river. We're talking about us. This is what Shinran means. And this is how he defines foolish beings. As expressed in the parable of the two rivers of water and fire, we are full of ignorance and blind passion. Our desires are countless, and anger, wrath, jealousy, and envy are overwhelming, arising without pause. To the very last moment of life, they do not cease or disappear or exhaust themselves. That's tough stuff to listen to. It's tough to think about. That's his description of us. We don't like to think of ourselves in that way. We like to be positive, of course. We want to emphasize the positive. We want to be optimistic. We don't like to be, depressed, and we don't like to be pessimistic and to think about all the negativity. And this seems to be very negative. It seems as though Shinran is focusing on all those bad things about people: anger, wrath, jealousy, and envy. Not only that, they arise without pause to the very last moment of life. This is really tough stuff, and it's really hard to think about us in those terms. And I think for many people, this is a big turnoff when they read this stuff or hear this kind of expression from Shinran. But he goes on. And yet, in spite of, or really because of that, our story does not end there. Shinran goes on to tell us this. When we who are so shameful go a step or two, little by little, along the white path of the power of the vow, we are taken in and held by the compassionate heart of the Buddha of unhindered light. It is fundamental that, because of this, we will unfailingly reach the Pure Land of happiness, whereupon we will be brought to realize the same enlightenment of great nirvana as Amida Tathagata, being born the flower of that perfect enlightenment. Wow. This is really just breathtaking. We who are so shameful, these beings, foolish beings that Shinran has just described in such negative terms, yet and because of this, we go on, live our lives a step or two, little by little, day by day, doing the best we can, taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, maybe falling down and trying to pick ourselves up again, doing the best we can. But as we walk along this path, the white path of the power of the vow, the path of Jodo Shinshu, the path of the Nembutsu, we find that we are taken in and held. We are embraced by the compassionate heart of the Buddha of unhindered light, the Buddha of wisdom compassion, of wisdom unfolding his compassion. And because of this, without fail, we will reach the Pure Land of happiness. We will realize the same enlightenment as Amida Tathagata. That is really breathtaking to hear that and to think about that. So there's an arising of Xinjin is also the rising of wisdom, okay? Realized as we are exposed within the Buddha's light, as Shinran says, because we are shown upon by this light, wisdom emerges in us. Where he says elsewhere, know that since Amida's vow is wisdom, the emergence of the mind of entrusting oneself to it is the arising of wisdom. And so there is in the rising of Xinjin, there is the arising of wisdom. But what form of wisdom is that? He says, we truly know we are simply foolish beings, unable to free ourselves from birth and death. And at the same time, we truly know that we are embraced within the compassionate heart of the Buddha of unhindered light, which will carry us to birth in the Pure Land. This is the wisdom that arises, the wisdom of Shinjin. Shinjin, that is wisdom. Well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to end this session on the arising of Shinjin. We don't have a lot of time today, and this is one topic that I had tried to touch upon last week, but ran out of time. But let me just say that there are other important issues that I think are important to consider in relationship to the topic of the arising of Shinjin. Here are just some of them. Things like saying the name versus hearing the name, self-power and other power. That's a small little topic. Shinjin in Buddha nature, Shinjin in the bodhicitta, the mind aspiring for enlightenment, time in Shinjin. Okay, what does the one thought moment of Shinjin mean? That was one of the aspects of that first passage that we didn't read in Shinran. This very famous passage of turning and entering the three vows, Sangan Tenyu. How does that play into the arising of Shinjin? Provisionality, upaya, or expediency in the arising of Shinjin. What does that function? And non-orthodox perspectives on the path of Shinjin. There are a number of other issues that we would consider in this regard, and they're all really interesting and all really important, and we just don't have the time to consider them today. I hope that you'll have a chance to study them in the future. Perhaps if you'd like to enroll in an IBS class, that would be a good opportunity to do so. We'll now talk about the implications of Shinjin. What do I mean by the implications of Shinjin? Well, I use that phrase intentionally. I chose it over ideas like consequences or results of Shinjin. I wanted to steer away from, if I could, from sort of formulaic conceptions of Shinjin. So, such as, well, do A to get Shinjin, and once you get Shinjin, you get this. You get this, you do this, you get Shinjin, this happens. Or you don't do anything, you get Shinjin and nothing happens. Something like that, either one of those formulas. I wanted to steer away from that. What I want to emphasize, however, is that Shinran teaches us that the arising of Shinjin has meaning. Okay, that's very significant. It has meaning, it has significance, and it brings benefit to our religious lives in this life. So there are many implications of Shinjin. And as you can only guess, we're not going to be able to cover all of them, but we want to touch upon a few. And particularly, we want to cover Shinran's teaching of the 10 benefits of Shinjin realized in the present life. In order to do so, I want to backtrack a bit to talk about what I'm calling the traditional Pure Land scheme. So there's a certain scheme that was at the foundation of the Pure Land movement within Buddhism. And the Pure Land movement, it's said, really began as a form of Buddhism for people who were not renunciants, who were not necessarily ordained, but were people who would be able to, wish to attain enlightenment, but wouldn't be able to renounce their homes and families and engage in practice in the same way as monks or nuns. Okay, so this is one rendition of that scheme. So basically, it says this: that because of the fact that people who were not renunciants did not have the opportunity or the conditions or the environment within which they could engage in practices and attain enlightenment, that there was an idea created that there was sort of another environment, a Buddha land, and that Buddhas, bodhisattvas would make vows and to create the land, and becoming enlightened beings and fulfilling the vows, a land would be created, and that land would be presided over by a Buddha who would preach the Dharma and guide beings in the performance of bodhisattva practices. And that beings then would attain birth in that land in another life, and in that land engage in bodhisattva practices, eventually realizing supreme nirvana. So that's what that scheme means. So that all of that takes place at the moment of death, however, under this traditional scheme. Another aspect of that traditional scheme is that in this world, in this life, we have a lot of questions facing us. How do I attain birth in that Buddha land in the next life? Do I practice a lot? Do I have to sit in meditation? Do I chant? Do I bow? Or do I have to believe? Do I have faith in the Buddha's power and the Buddha's teaching? Which one is it? Or is there a combination of the two? What's the right mix? What's the right formula that allows me to attain birth in that land after I die? And it's in the scheme, then, it's described that once one is born in that land, one attains various benefits. Okay, one is entitled entry into the ranks of true settlement. What that means is that once one attains birth in that land, one basically attains the first stage of bodhisattvahood, in the sense that one, or the 41st stage of bodhisattvahood, in the sense that one has now is assured that one will eventually attain enlightenment in the future. This is also called the stage of non-retrogression, that once one reaches the stage, there's no falling back. It's only going forward. Or another description is the necessary attainment of nirvana, that one will necessarily, through practice, through long periods of time, eventually attain nirvana. Or another way of describing it, later on, one of the later stages is the stage of the equal of complete enlightenment, which is much later in that ranking. Okay, so this is sort of the traditional Pure Land scheme. Shinran reformulated that scheme. He really upended that scheme, primarily because of his insight that enlightenment moves, that enlightenment is not simply the goal that we strive to reach through our own efforts and powers, but it is wisdom unfolding as compassion that reaches out to us, that brings enlightenment, that brings peace and joy and fulfillment to us. And because of that scheme, because of his sort of sea change in thinking regarding the movement and activity of enlightenment, his formulation then of religious life and birth in the Pure Land also went through a major change. So for Shinran, what's important is not so much the moment of death. That's not the critical moment in a person's religious life. The critical moment is the moment of Xinjin, the arising of Xinjin. Okay, that takes place in this world and in this life. So that's the box to the left. And for Shinran, then, upon the realization of Xinjin, one immediately realized these are words that should sound familiar: entry into the ranks of true settlement, attaining of the stage of non-retrogression, realizing the necessary attainment of nirvana, and reaching the stage of the equal of complete enlightenment. These are phrases that Shinran uses to describe the benefits realized by the person of Xinjin in this life, in this world, okay, which before him were descriptions of attainment that are realized upon birth in the Pure Land. For Shinran, birth in the Pure Land, the land of immeasurable life, taking place after death, in that time, in that moment, one attains great complete nirvana immediately. Okay, a very different scheme than what we saw prior to Shinran. And part of that scheme then, as we continue to sort of look at this in more detail, Shinran describes, he says, in the one thought moment of Shinjin, in this world and this life, he says, when we realize the diamond-like true mind, again, these are synonyms for Shinjin, we saw that last week, we transcend crosswise the path of the 5 courses and 8 hindered existences and unfailingly gain 10 benefits in the present life. What are the 10? Let me just read these very carefully. We're not very quickly. We're not going to cover all of these, unfortunately. We just don't have the time. But I wanted to introduce this idea to you. So what are the 10? 1, the benefit of being protected and sustained by unseen powers. 2, the benefit of being possessed of supreme virtues. 3, the benefit of our karmic evil being transformed into good. 4, the benefit of being protected and cared for by all the Buddhas. 5, the benefit of being praised by all the Buddhas. 6, the benefit of being constantly protected by the light of the Buddha's heart. 7, the benefit of having great joy in our hearts. 8, the benefit of being aware of Amida's benevolence and responding in gratitude to his virtue. 9, the benefit of constantly practicing great compassion. And 10, the benefit of entering the stage of the truly settled. And then, of course, then, as mentioned before, upon birth in the Pure Land, after death, one realizes a great, complete nirvana. Again, I'm really sorry we're not going to have time to cover all of these benefits. It's just there's no time. But let's just cover a couple of them if we could. There's benefit 3, the transformation of our karmic evil into good. This is really fascinating, and it really raises a lot of very important issues when we talk about the implications of the arising of Shinjin. Okay, what is the nature of evil, and how is evil transformed? What is the nature of transformation, and how is it transformed into good? Shinran describes this in a couple of his hymns on the Pure Land Masters. The first one goes like this: Through the benefit of the unhindered light, we realize Shinjin of vast, majestic virtues, and the ice of our blind passions necessarily melts, immediately becoming water of enlightenment. It's a fascinating concept, right? Because of the light, when we realize Shinjin, the ice of our blind passion, the ice of our klesha, our delusions, okay? Our delusions, our klesha, are described as the ice, and that ice begins to melt inevitably, necessarily, okay, naturally, begins to melt within the illumination of the unhindered light of the Buddha in the person of Shinjin. And as our ice melts, it immediately, without any day, within any time intervening, they become the water of enlightenment. What does that mean? How could the ice of our passions, our delusions and klesha melt and immediately become the water of enlightenment? Shinran goes on to talk about this in another hymn, the next hymn. Obstructions of karmic evil turn into virtues. It is like the relation of ice and water. The more the ice, the more the water. The more the obstructions, the more the virtues. It's kind of an interesting concept as well, okay? That now our karmic evil, our obstructions, karmic evil has a lot of ways to think about karmic evil, okay? And certainly there's a whole range of meaning in our descriptions of evil. Probably the most generic one, the one that's probably most generally true, or we could point to, is that here evil means that whatever we do, or let's say whatever I do, whatever I say, whatever I think, it just, rather than bringing me closer to enlightenment, it pushes me ever closer to remain within samsaric existence, okay? That my actions, my karma, my thoughts, words, and deeds, because they're grounded in fundamental ignorance, of my not getting it, of my seeing things wrong in the wrong way, of my thinking incorrectly. We'll talk about what that means later on. Thinking incorrectly is a sense of this, what we'll use a lot of fancy words later on, discriminative consciousness, dichotomous thinking. Basically what it means is that I get it wrong. When I think about things, when I look out into the world, I have a basic flaw. And that flaw is I'm always making distinctions. You know, just sitting here, I'm thinking, well, here's me, I'm talking, and there's all of you listening. So there's a me and there's a you. You know, we make other distinctions between ourselves and others, between up and down, good and bad, young and old, men and women, rich and poor. We make all these distinctions based upon our own passions, our own defilements, our own biases, our own conditioning. And they serve us, really, when you think about it, they do no good. In fact, they do more harm than good, because they tend to divide us, to create divisions when there really are none, when there really should be none. And based on those divisions, we create value, we have value judgments. We say, this is better than that. This takes precedence over that. This is more privileged than that. And we create hardship for ourselves and others. And this is the evil that we create constantly, even in spite of our best of intentions sometimes. This is just the way we are. And these are obstructions to our really coming to understand everything just as it is, coming to live with peace and tranquility and equanimity. So our karmic evil obstructs us from that true life, okay? But here Shinran says that karmic evil turns into virtue, just like ice and water. The more the ice, the more the water. The more the obstructions, the more the virtues. The more delusions we have, the more virtues they become in this transformation that is the implication of Shinjin. It's very dramatic, but again, what does that mean? What do we make of that? Well, here's one attempt to try to make some sense of it. This is my teacher, Shigeru Sensei, often shared this haiku poem. In fact, he actually he drew this. This is his artwork here. Okay, his calligraphy and his artwork. In Japanese, the haiku goes like this: Shibugaki no shibu ga sono mama amami kana. Shibugaki no shibuga, sono mama amami kana. As I translate, how very sweet is the bitterness of the bitter persimmon. This is a poem about kaki, persimmons, as we all know. And I think, as we all know, there are different varieties of persimmon. There's the persimmon that sort of looks like an apple or a tomato. I forgot the name of it. Those of you out there, you know the name. I can't remember what it is. Is it fuyu? I can't remember. I won't make an attempt to remember. But that's the kind of persimmon you actually peel and eat. It's pretty sweet, tastes pretty good. But there's another kind of persimmon that's not that way. It's sometimes called the shibugaki, and or hachi, I think, right? That has a different shape, a different form, and that one you can't peel and eat. You can't just pick it off a branch and do it, because if you do, your lips will pucker up, your mouth will pucker up, because it's very bitter, or astringent is a word actually used to describe that. So you can't possibly eat a bitter persimmon. But what you can do, and this is what a lot of people do, and it's one of my favorite things about the fall, is you can peel it and then hang it out in the air and allow the air and the sun and the wind to work their magic on the persimmon. And as the persimmon hangs out there in the air, it gradually comes to dry. It gets all sort of wrinkly and brown. And usually if you have a really bitter persimmon, on the outside, the exterior of that wrinkled up dried persimmon, you get this white powder, which is sugar. And what this poem that Shigaraki Sensei always loved to talk about means is this, is that the very bitterness of the bitter persimmon transforms naturally and becomes sweet. The more bitter the persimmon, the sweeter the dried persimmon. But it doesn't, the bitterness doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't disappear. It's not removed. It transforms. It becomes the sweetness. And that becoming the sweetness, that transformation, is what Shinran is talking about in these poems, but also in the 10 benefits realized by the person of Shinjin in this life. That our karma and all the consequences of our karma create nothing but hardship. But as we entrust ourselves to the vow of Amida Buddha, as we awaken to wisdom unfolding as compassion, somehow, in spite of ourselves, all of those experiences, that karma, our actions, our intentions, our calculations, and other consequences transform. They become transformed and become the stuff of enlightenment, become the possibility of enlightenment, the possibility of Buddhahood. It's inconceivable. It can't be explained in rational terms, but it's that sense then of something very important being implied in the arising of Shinjin. Another one of the benefits is benefit 9, constantly practicing great compassion. And Shinran, in this sense, I think we can refer to his quoting of the master Shandao, who says this in these very famous words: "To realize Shinjin oneself and to guide others to Shinjin is among difficult things yet even more difficult. To awaken beings everywhere to great compassion is truly to respond in gratitude to the Buddha's benevolence." This sense then of realizing Shinjin oneself and guiding others to Shinjin. There's a famous phrase in Japanese, Jishin Kyonin Shin. He says is the most, among difficult things, the most difficult. But to be able to awaken beings to great compassion is a response in gratitude. It's very difficult to do so. It's very difficult to bring others to realize Shinjin, let alone, certainly for ourselves, as we talked about last time, let alone others. And yet somehow within the great movement, the great activity of wisdom unfolding, of compassion, and of our response to that activity, our awakening and our response to that activity of the Buddha's benevolence, there is the possibility, there is the hope, there is the potential, there is the condition for helping to awaken other beings to this great compassion. So the sense of constantly practicing great compassion, in many ways, it's centrally tied to our saying the Nembutsu and our realizing Shinjin but it has other implications as well. Here's a very famous letter that Shinran wrote to one of his followers in Kanto. I think it's familiar to many of you. Shinran says this: those who feel uncertain of birth should say the Nembutsu, aspiring first for their own birth. Those who feel that their own birth is completely settled should, mindful of the Buddha's benevolence, hold the Nembutsu in their hearts and say it to respond in gratitude to that benevolence with the wish, may there be peace in the world and may the Buddha's teaching spread. Once again, say the Nembutsu, being mindful of the Buddha's benevolence, and when Shinjin arises, and say the Nembutsu again with a deep sense of response and gratitude for the Buddha's benevolence, with the wish, here very specifically, may there be peace in the world, may the Buddha's teaching spread. And I would say, not simply stopping at the wish, but with allowing that wish, or as he says in another part of the letter, that prayer, to become actualized, to become a part of who we are, to take life within our lives and in our actions as well. So we may direct ourselves out of gratitude for the Buddha's benevolence to the bringing of peace in the world, to the spread of the Dharma, to bringing something new and important to the worldly discourse, which is all too often filled with hatred and prejudice and bias and discrimination, bringing to that discourse the teaching of the Buddha, the teaching of equality and equanimity, of peace and joy. So anyway, I think this is part of how we can understand this benefit of constantly practicing great compassion. And finally, benefit 10, the entry into the ranks of the truly settled. We talked about that a little bit before. This is often seen to be sort of the foundational benefit. This is the benefit from which all the other benefits arise. And it's one of the real, I think, landmark contributions that Shinran makes to Pure Land thought. I would just read this passage to you, and there's so much packed into it. We'll just talk about it a little bit if we could. There's a phrase, they then attain birth, in the passage on the fulfillment of the 18th vow. They then attain birth, or in Japanese, soku toku ojo. Okay? So this phrase, they then attain birth, means that when a person realizes Shinjin, he or she is born immediately. To be born immediately is to dwell in the stage of non-retrogression. To dwell in the stage of non-retrogression is to become established in the stage of the truly settled. Such is the meaning of they then attain birth. Then means immediately. Immediately means without any passage of time and without any passage of days. And as he says in another text, attain means to have attained what one shall attain. There's so much here. There's so much that we could focus on. And this is unfortunately one of those areas that I will mention that it really is one of the issues that comes up as we discuss and think about the implications of Shinjin. The whole idea of birth. What is birth? What is attainment in the immediate present? What is the notion of time and immediacy? All of these are crucial questions to us. Shinran also mentions that a person of Shinjin is a true disciple of Buddha. Okay, he says disciple indicates a disciple of Shakyamuni and the other Buddhas, not just of Amida Buddha, but Shakyamuni and the other Buddhas. This expression refers to the practicer who has realized the diamond-like heart and mind. Through this Shinjin in practice, one will, without fail, transcend and realize great nirvana. Hence, one is called true disciple of Buddha. So the person of Shinjin is a true disciple of Buddha in the truest sense of the word. Well, again, as I mentioned, there are many important issues that pertain to the implications of Shinjin. We just don't have time to touch upon them, but they're fascinating and they're very important, very enticing. And some of you are probably upset that we're not going to get to them today, but maybe in the future. Here are some of them. The immediate attainment of birth, here I use air quotes, in this life versus birth in the Pure Land. Are they the same thing? Are they different? How do they relate? What is the meaning of each? And the whole sense of birth versus salvation or liberation or crossing over. What is the nature? What is the nature of liberation, of freedom in Shin Buddhism? How might that best be described? The evil person is the object of Amida Buddha's primal vow. The sense of evil in the evil person is really important. It's one that I think many people are very concerned about from a lot of different standpoints, not just a sense of religious soteriology of being born in the Pure Land, but also a sense of our living today, as we'll see below. Another question, one that I almost was going to have us talk about, is Shinjin and joy, or Shinjin and gratitude. Again, very important things that we're just going to run out of time to talk about. Other artistic expression of Shinjin. I want to talk about a couple examples later on in the last hour. And Shinjin and social ethics, Shinjin and social praxis or social action, Shin Buddhism and politics. Another big issue is the exclusion clauses of the 18th vow and the passage on the fulfillment of the 18th vow. Those are big issues as well. Shin Buddhism and religious exclusivity, inclusivity, and pluralism, and the Shin Buddhist message today, among others. There's so many topics that pertain to the implication of Shinjin. I wish we had time to consider them. We just don't. So what I'd like to talk about in this last portion is what I'm calling exposure and embrace. Now, as I mentioned before, there are three worlds that we inhabit when we read a text: the world behind the text, the world within the text, and the world in front of the text. In this final session, exposure and embrace, we'll be dwelling in the world in front of Shinran's text. And I would, based in that and within that world in front of the text, that's within the world of the reader, the world of the person who is receiving these teachings and ideas, and working with them in one's own way, in one's own context, one's own religious concerns, one's own background and understanding, within the context of one's own path of religious search and search for meaning. Okay, so in that world in front of the text, I'd like to suggest this. These are just now, we're in the area of sort of my interpretations, of my appreciation of Shinran's text. And I'd like to say this: I think Shinjin signifies that the Buddha's vow mind becomes fulfilled when we are exposed and emptied, even as we find ourselves embraced and enabled to live with a deep sense of interconnectedness and gratitude for all existences. That's how I appreciate Shinran's teachings of Xinjin. And let me try to explain what I mean by that. So Shinran was a follower of the Pure Land tradition of Honen. He always said he was a follower of Honen, a disciple of Honen. He never expressly said that he was going beyond Honen or surpassing his teacher. He was always very grateful, very reverential to Honen and the other Pure Land masters. But at the same time, Shinran was thoroughly fluent in Mahayana Buddhist philosophy and practice. We can see that in his texts, in his citations, in his thinking and philosophy that he brings to the text. That insight, I believe, contributed to his reformulation of the Pure Land path of enlightenment and his perspective on the unfolding of wisdom as compassion. So, Mahayana Buddhism, what are some of the Mahayana foundations of Shinran's thoughts? It's at this point that I have to say I feel a great disturbance in the force. It's as if dozens of my former students' voices are shouting out in frustration, "No, Mahayana structure of Shinran's thought again. We have to go through that." This is sort of complicated stuff. If the stuff before us wasn't complicated enough, this is another level of complication. But it's important to the extent that if we want to really get a sense of what Shinran is doing in his reformulation of the Pure Land path. I won't go over in great detail, and there's a lot of information here. My thinking is that we'll cover it quickly because of the fact that this will be recorded and it'll be on YouTube. If you're interested in this, you can go back over it and look at it at a more leisurely pace. But let me just cover some of the fundamental aspects or thoughts regarding Mahayana Buddhism, the great vehicle, and its impact on Shinran's thought. So who's the ideal practitioner in the Mahayana Buddhist path? It's known as the Bodhisattva, the person in search of enlightenment. And if we take a real brief look at the career of the Bodhisattva, it begins as the Bodhisattva engages the path by awakening the mind of aspiring for enlightenment, the bodhicitta, the bodhi mind, not simply for oneself, but for all other beings. And that's really crucial. These twin aspirations, okay, aspiring for one's own self-benefit, but for benefit for all, find expression ultimately in the Bodhisattva's vows. Upon declaring those vows, the Bodhisattva then undertakes over great innumerable kalpas of time the practice of something called prajna paramita, or non-discriminative wisdom. I talked about discriminative wisdom a little bit before. That's a fancy word. We also use the word like dichotomous thinking or just false thinking to refer to the fact that normally, conventionally, we just don't get it. We think we understand ourselves, we think we understand the world, but we're just messing things up. We're making distinctions where there are none. We're creating value judgments that only bring harm. We're not helpful when we just don't get because we don't understand the basic reality of existence. We're just doing things based upon our own desires, our own thoughts, our own very small sphere of understanding, our own logic, our own biases. And that's what's then inherent in our thinking as unenlightened beings. That's what makes us unenlightened. And so the practice of prajna paramita, of non-discriminative wisdom, is vital to the career of a Mahayana bodhisattva. So this path of enlightenment is framed in a very complex sense of directionality. So there's one sense where the bodhisattva encounters the finitude of one's samsaric existence, and attaining non-discriminative wisdom ultimately goes to suchness, reaches nirvana, attains nirvana, okay? This completely transcends all aspects of one's existence. And the awakened one comes from suchness, returns to work actively, compassionately, and immanently in samsaric existence for the sake of all being. The very word tathagata has that dual meaning of going to suchness and coming from suchness. So that's the sort of sense of directionality in the Mahayana Buddhist path. And it appears time and time again. In one sense, this famous discussion of samsara and nirvana reflects that. If we say simply samsara is nirvana, that's in a way, it's an expression of the path from this world of delusion and pain, this world of birth and death, samsara, to nirvana. And that thinking at this point lies on an irreversible path of going from samsara to nirvana, okay? This is how we view it from our own perspective, our own sense of undertaking this path. I'm going to go from here to there, sort of idea. But this path is a long one. It's a gradual process of transformation in which ignorance and craving that bind one to this existence are eliminated through practice. On the other hand, nirvana samsara reflects a very different reality, with a reality that also it exists at the very same time, okay? Paradoxically. The path is non-dual. It's not simply unidirectional when viewed from the standpoint of true reality. On this path, attainment or realization is identical with every step along the path. Dogen has a very famous phrase, shusho itto, practice and enlightenment are one and the same, are identical, that sort of sense. Each step along the way, each practice, each nembutsu then becomes identical with realization, okay? And every time false discrimination is eliminated, true reality manifests itself. So every step of practice is identical with ultimate realization, okay? So that's another sense of not simply samsara is nirvana, but nirvana is samsara, reflecting that bidirectionality of the path, what I like to call the ambivalence of the path, ambivalence of the path. Form and emptiness is another set of concepts that reflects a very similar reality. From the Prajna Paramita in 25,000 lines, there's a very, very famous passage that goes like this. Form is not different from emptiness. Emptiness is not different from form. Form is itself emptiness. Emptiness is itself form. Now, what the heck does this mean? You would think that form and emptiness are the polar opposites. If something has form, there's an image to it, there's a structure to it, it has substance, whereas emptiness is without form. So the two, you would think the two are polar opposites, they can't coexist. But in Mahayana, the sense is form is itself emptiness, emptiness is itself form. What does that mean? The initial phrase, form is emptiness, might mean this, that discriminative and ego-centered thinking, that is our false thinking, has been completely broken through, and we realize what might be called no mind. This would then imply that our normal way of thinking, creating a subject-object dichotomy, that structure of thought, that structure of being that's based on that thought is completely eradicated. And it dissolves into infinite nothingness. So form is emptiness. We realize and recognize that what we thought conventionally to be form is emptiness. But it goes on to say, emptiness is form. Even as false discrimination ends, discrimination based on wisdom and practice still function. This is the mind of no mind. This is beautiful Mahayana logic of no logic. This is why my students and former students are groaning as they have to listen to this once again. It's mind-boggling in a way of describing it. Non-discriminative wisdom and the object perceived by that wisdom are not separate things. And let's talk about what all of these things mean. And this is a little challenging to our logical way of thought, but it's really, I believe, lies at the foundation of Shinran's reformulation of the Pure Land Path. Stated in another way, non-discriminative wisdom, sometimes called not seeing, arises when dichotomous thinking ceases, and the subject, that is the one who sees, and the object which is seen, become one. We'll talk about this in a little while. Thus, the Bodhisattva is able to see things just as they are, in their absolute particularity, and also in their non-difference from all other things. Okay, it's kind of difficult to understand. This is where Mahayana logic gets a little bit challenging. So let's continue on. I think hopefully things will begin to resolve themselves. There's a school of Buddhism called consciousness only or subjectivity only. The words are Vijnapti Matrata or Yogacara. This is a form of thought which describes the practical implications of this idea that form is emptiness, emptiness is form. There's a particular text, Asanga Mahayana Samgraha, which sets forth this idea that on the Bodhisattva path, the Bodhisattva realizes three aspects of non-discriminative wisdom, of wisdom that breaks through our conventional false thinking. It takes place in three aspects, or three, maybe phases is not the word, but three kinds. It begins this way, with preparatory non-discriminative wisdom. Here, the Bodhisattva is still dwelling within the realm that we're all familiar with, the realm of duality, the realm of thinking, okay, here am I wish to attain enlightenment. I will learn the Dharma. I will practice the way. I will realize, I will attain realization. There's still this I and you, I and thou sort of situation, this sort of sense of making distinctions in life, okay? But the Bodhisattva is willing to learn, okay? And so, but when the Bodhisattva looks out into the world, the Bodhisattva still sees things as objects, okay? So here I use the phrase, first there is a mountain. I don't know, this is something when I go over, I usually mention this to people. And when I do, I ask a question, and based upon the answer, I know sort of what your age group is, but I can't see you right now, but I'll ask it anyway. I don't know how many of you are familiar with an old singer by the name of Donovan. Donovan was popular way back in the 60s and 70s, for those of you who were only born in the 90s. And there was a song he sang, first there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. I don't know if you remember it. Anyway, I'm going to hearken back to that song. So the preparatory non-discriminative wisdom, where the Bodhisattva is getting ready, is learning the Dharma, learning the practices, but still is living within this world and still thinking in the way that we normally think, which is false thinking, thinks, oh, look at over there. There is a mountain. It's this great big thing made out of rocks and dirt and has trees on it. I am here, the mountain is there. I would like to climb that mountain. Okay, still thinking in that dualistic sense. But through practice over long periods of time, the Bodhisattva eventually attains what's called fundamental non-discriminative wisdom. Here, the Bodhisattva enters into the realm of non-duality and overcomes all dichotomous thinking. All distinctions that we make usually conventionally are overcome. The Bodhisattva sees the oneness, the non-duality of all existences. All objects of perception are recognized to be empty. Okay. And here the Bodhisattva realizes, then there is no mountain. What I thought to be a separate existence from myself, this huge pile of rocks and dirt, I saw and I defined as mountain. I was willing to say this is an existence apart from myself. But now I realize that there is no mountain, because that was only an object of my perception. Okay. And that perception has now been broken through. But it doesn't end there. If it all ended there, then Buddhism would be a bunch of people staring at their navels, sitting under Bodhi trees, and that's all it would be, and it wouldn't amount to too much. But Buddhism, the Buddhist path, the Bodhisattva path, doesn't end with fundamental non-discriminative wisdom. It evolves, it unfolds. I said enfolds, it should be unfolds. It unfolds as something called subsequently attained non-discriminative wisdom. Which is this, that the Bodhisattva, still grounded within this, this breakthrough of being able to overcome conventional false thinking, still dwelling within the realm of non-duality, in a sense, returns to duality, returns to this world of samsara. Okay, the Bodhisattva comes from suchness, returns to this world of samsara, and is able to perceive people and things as objects, but realizing that in reality, they're not separate things, okay? So the perception is of beings, but the realization is that these objects of perception are we're just calling them provisionally, objects, okay? They don't really exist. They're empty of any inherent self-nature. But the Bodhisattva, knowing this, is able to perceive people and objects in all of their uniqueness, all of their differences, but grounded in non-dichotomous thinking. So the Bodhisattva is able to say, then there is a mountain, knowing that in reality, there's no mountain separate from the self, but there is a mountain in this realm of samsara, in the sense of dualistic thinking, to which the Bodhisattva returns. And this is a sense of wisdom unfolding, not enfolding, unfolding as compassion. So there are implications of this. Oops, let me go back. I'll just try to cover this more quickly. I promise to be more quick, and I'll do so. One of the results of this is something that Yogacara calls subjectivity only with no objects. That's what is often subjectivity only or consciousness only. And there are certainly implications of that. The Bodhisattva that practices and realizes non-discriminative wisdom, prajnaparamita, is able to know things by becoming them. This is a really weird way of thinking, but when you think about the logic that we just talked about, this is one of the implications, that the seer vanishes into identity with the seen, knowing that there's no separate existence between the two, only entering into the realm of non-duality. And in that sense, the Bodhisattva is able to know things by becoming them. There's no distinction whatsoever, no separation between existences. On the path to enlightenment, truth does not exist apart from falsity, and falsity does not exist apart from truth. We have to go on to 3 to make some sense of that. Wisdom exposes emptiness and falsity of ignorance. Wisdom exposes the emptiness and falsity, even as it embraces and transforms emptiness and falsity into virtue. So wisdom, non-discriminative wisdom, is able to perceive the falsity of existence and thinking, but is able to embrace that, to take that in and transform that into virtue. That's much what we saw before with Shinran saying, the more the ice, the more the water, okay? And that realized wisdom manifests itself as compassionate activity. That's what we've been talking about. And that's sort of a mantra that I'll keep repeating throughout the day. Wisdom unfolds as compassion. That wisdom that transcends all discrimination takes on any form, okay, that accommodates itself to the capacities of ignorant beings in order to lead them to enlightenment. So the bodhisattva comes from suchness, returns from suchness, sees beings for what they are, understands that fundamentally they're all empty and false, but embraces the emptiness and false, and takes form in a way that ignorant, unenlightened beings can perceive in order to lead beings to enlightenment. That is, in many ways, sort of the fundamental structure of the bodhisattva career. I'll kind of go over this theme over and over again. It's paradoxical in some ways. It's puzzling in many ways. But I would submit, and this is just my opinion, my interpretation, that I believe Shinran's understanding of the Pure Land path was grounded upon that, and that he offered a Shin Buddhist view, which is very unique in the sense that wisdom is experience, but not from the standpoint, not from the perspective of the bodhisattva, the subject of perception, but from the standpoint of the object of perception, the unenlightened foolish being. Okay, and I'll return to this thought again. Okay, again, that's just my appreciation, my understanding of Shinran in the world in front of the text. Shinran goes on to quote Tan Wan, one of the Pure Land masters from China, in his chapter on true realization, and he presents this theory of the two kinds of Dharma body, Dharmakaya. The first is Dharma body as suchness, Hosho Hoshing, literally meaning Dharma nature, Dharma body. And the second is Dharma body as compassionate means, Hoben Hoshing, literally Upaya Dharmakaya, or expedient Dharmakaya. How does this work? The first, the Dharma body as suchness, Hosho Hoshing, Shinran describes this way: has neither color nor form, thus the mind cannot grasp it, nor words describe it. This is a reference then to supreme nirvana, to enlightenment or truth and reality, which transcends all words, all language, all perception. That whatever we know, whatever words or ideas we have at our disposal to try to define something, it's inadequate. Okay, it doesn't have color, we can't see it. It doesn't have form either. We can't grasp it, we can't explain it, we can't describe it. It's beyond our capacity to conceptualize. Its inherent and fundamental formlessness. That is Dharma body as suchness. But it doesn't end there. Okay? If it ended there, again, enlightenment would be sitting out there in some little pile in the universe out there and wouldn't have anything to do with all of us ignorant beings. It doesn't end there. Dharma body moves. It acts. And that action, it takes the form of the Dharma body as compassionate means, Hoben Hoshing. As Shinran says, from this oneness that is without form, was manifested form, called Dharma body as compassionate means. And here's the kicker: this is none other than Amida Tathagata. So for Shinran, Amida Buddha is this: Dharma body as compassionate means, the form that arises out of formlessness. Okay, but he goes more. I think I've just sort of repeated myself. So I'm going to skip over this page. Pardon me. So I think Shinran has a very also clear insight into the nature of Amida Buddha in the Pure Land. He says, the Buddha is the Tathagata of inconceivable light, and the land also is the land of immeasurable light. Both Amida Buddha and the land are immeasurable light, inconceivable light. Okay. Or, as I gather from this, is his realization that Amida Buddha is the activity of wisdom unfolding as compassion within the realm of samsara. Or as he says, this is sort of putting some of a kind of a visual to Shinran's explanation. Compassionate means, again, this form arising out of formlessness refers to manifesting form, revealing a name and making itself known to sentient beings. It refers to Amida Buddha. So this form that arises out of formlessness refers to Amida Buddha, But interestingly enough, it reveals a name, making itself known to sentient beings. What is that name? Again, as we know, as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, it is Namo Amidabutsu. Namo Amidabutsu is the name, that is the form in which the Buddha reveals itself, making itself known to beings. And that's why Shinran says, the name of the Buddha is not Amida Buddha, it's Namo Amidabutsu. Okay, that's the name that is revealed when formlessness arises as form. And he also goes on to say, this Tathagata is light. Light is none other than wisdom. Wisdom is the form of light. Wisdom is, in addition, formless, kind of folding back on itself now. But again, then this Buddha, Amida Tathagata, is also light. Light is wisdom. Wisdom is the form of light, which is also formless. So this sense then of ultimate reality or enlightenment, of wisdom that is beyond our conception or on our explanation, doesn't just sit out there in some far corner of the universe, but it's wisdom because it unfolds as compassion. The wisdom of the Buddhas is that there is no distinction between self and other, between enlightened beings and ignorant beings, that everything has a stake in everything else, okay? There is a vast interconnectedness of all beings. And so wisdom in that form must manifest that compassion. Otherwise, it wouldn't be wisdom. Otherwise, it's just words. It's just an abstract concept. Wisdom in identifying the non-duality of all things must arise as compassion. And the form, Shinran says, that it arises in is name, Namo Amidabutsu, and light. That is Amida Buddha. Shinran also says that the Buddha land are Buddha nature. I'll sort of just skip over that right now. Buddha nature is a big question, one that I wish we had more time to talk about, but I'll just read this passage from Shinran for you just to get you interested, okay? And maybe this sort of stimulates some curiosity and you want to continue on with your study of Buddha nature and Shinran. I encourage you to do so. Here's one passage that Shinran writes about Buddha nature. He says, Buddha nature is none other than Tathagata. This Tathagata pervades the countless world. It fills the hearts and minds of the ocean of all beings. Thus, plants, trees, and land all attain Buddhahood. Since it is with this heart and mind of all sentient beings that they entrust themselves to the vow of the Dharma body as compassionate means, this Shinjin is none other than Buddha nature. Buddha nature is many things, okay? It's not simply the potential or seed for Buddhahood, it's also fundamental reality of Buddhahood. It's the process, it's the means by which one attains Buddhahood. It's all of those things. And Shinran understands that and folds that concept of Buddhahood, Buddha nature, into this sort of framework of Amida Buddha and Xinjin. I'm going to skip this because I think I'm repeating myself here. And I already said that too. A lot of repetition. So I'll skip that. So this sense then, I believe, let me just a little bit go back, just a bit, sorry about that. This last paragraph, that in this scheme of suchness manifesting itself as form in the form of name and light, okay, making itself known to us. I think this is really crucial. And what's also crucial, again, is just my interpretation, is that Shinran, in his consideration of this vast scheme of the activity of wisdom unfolding compassion, realizes that for us, we're looking at this from the standpoint of the foolish being, of the object of the bodhisattva's perception, not as the bodhisattva, but as the one who is false and empty, who is exposed by the light, embraced by the wisdom rising as compassion. I think that, to me, that's a crucial contribution that Shinran makes to this discourse. And that experience of exposure and embrace is referenced, I think, in Shandao's teaching of the two profound kinds of realization, or Nishu Jinshin. This is another version of the deep mind that Shinran is aware of. Shandao presents this in his commentary on the Contemplation Sutra. Since we've already covered it in another version, I won't go over it again, okay? But I will say this, that as Shinran cites Shandao, he reveals that the deep mind is the content of Xinjin itself. It has two aspects: the fundamental impossibility for us to attain nirvana, that we as ignorant sentient beings have no condition that would bring us to realize liberation or nirvana. It's not in us. We don't have the karmic makeup. And the absolute certainty of our attainment of nirvana through the vow, okay? And both aspects form the single realization, the content of a single realization. Neither is the prerequisite for the other. It's not that we have to realize one before the other. They arise together in a mutual interrelationship as Shinjin, okay? And that sort of is another way of describing this scheme that I was just sort of trying to introduce to you today. And once again, as I mentioned before, I'll just touch upon it, that Shinran says the realization of Shinjin is the arising of wisdom. But it's a very different kind of wisdom. It's a counterintuitive sense of wisdom. It's a wisdom that arises when we realize deeply and profoundly our own finitude, our own falsity and emptiness, when we awaken to ourselves as ordinary foolish beings, okay? This is wisdom. It's not what we usually think of when we talk about wisdom. We think wisdom means, oh, we're sitting there, we're so wise, and we see everything, and we know everything, and we're great, these wonderful sages. But for Shinran, wisdom, the arising of wisdom and Shinjin, is to come face to face with the reality of ourselves, okay? Of ourselves, our limited nature, our falsity and emptiness. But the interesting thing is, even this is beyond our capability. We're not even capable of seeing that. That only comes about when Buddha wisdom unfolds as compassion. And so, coming to some concluding remarks here of this section, we come to know the Buddha when we find ourselves illuminated by the wisdom light, when we are exposed by the light, emptied by the light. Our false claims to independence, agency, ableness, and omnipotence are exposed and emptied within the light. It's exactly in that emptying that there arises the possibility of our being able to know ourselves and live genuine lives. We awaken to the reality of wisdom and compassion in all existences and find ourselves able to be participants in the activity of wisdom and compassion in our lives. That's also what I learned from Shinran in the world in front of the text. Let me give you a couple of examples just to talk about what I mean by that. I think a lot of you are familiar with Shinran, of course, but I think a lot of you are also familiar with Dogen, Zenji, and Zen, especially Soto Zen. As much as I revere Shinran, I really, really like Dogen. I love to read Dogen. Long ago, in another facet of my life, I actually sat in Zazen until I realized it's really hard. But Dogen is really brilliant. And one of the interesting things about Dogen is Dogen and Shinran lived in about the same era of Kamakura era, Japan. And it's possible they both lived in Kyoto at the same time. I don't know if they had any relationship with each other, but certainly they were Buddhists who were living within the same sort of milieu, the same environment of religious concern and religious action. And so it would stand to reason that they would respond to common religious concerns or thoughts. One of the great things about being at IBS, I enjoy very, very much, is I get to interact with some of my colleagues. This is certainly before COVID. And back at the time, we used to be able to sit together and talk. I've had many wonderful conversations with one of my colleagues, Dr. Daijaku Kinst. Dr. Kinst, as many of you know, she had been the director of our chaplaincy program for many years, but she's also a Zen priest in the San Francisco Zen Center lineage. She's a wonderful person, a wonderful priest, a wonderful scholar. And she and I would sit down sometimes for maybe not hours, but for a long, long time and just sort of let it go. Just talk about Zen and Shinshu. And we just love to talk about it. And there was a time, as I recall, when I brought to her this famous passage from Dogen, from the Genjo Koan in his Shobo Genzo. This is a passage translated by Robert Aitken and Kazuaki Tanahashi. I think you've probably all heard this in one version or another. So I presented this version to her. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. When actualized by myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. I've always been curious about this passage. I have my own opinions about it. Daijok and I talked about it. And as is true in many of our conversations, we just started riffing. We started just going off and speculating. And I suggested that might Dogen be saying this in this passage? This is just me, so don't put any stake in it, but this is just my impression. I'm just wondering, I asked her, might Dogen be saying this? That Buddha nature is revealed when the self, actualized by myriad things, sees that it is empty. That in the practice, as we come to see ourselves as fundamentally empty, and this sense in that is being actualized by myriad things that fall away, at that moment, Buddha nature is revealed. Is that perhaps what Dogen is saying? I asked the question because it seems to me, if that is the case, this would be a focus on one's encounter with the non-dual nature of reality, but within this realm of duality. Okay, living within this realm of duality, one comes to encounter non-duality. And using different religious language, maybe this is an insight into a sense of immanent transcendence, okay? That what is transcending beyond us is something we encounter within, okay? In other words, maybe Dogen is saying this, that which is beyond the self is revealed within none other than the self itself. Lots of selves, bad English, but that's what I'm wondering. That which is beyond the self is revealed within the self. Okay, is that perhaps what Dogen is saying? And if he is, then I speculated, I wonder if Shinran might be saying this. Myriad things are actualized when the self is exposed by emptiness or Buddha nature. Once again, myriad things are actualized when the self is exposed by emptiness, Buddha nature. Very similar words, but in different order and with different meaning. This perspective, and again, I'm just speculating, would be focusing on the exposure of our dualistic apprehension of reality, that is our false thinking, within compassionate activity that unfolds from non-dual wisdom. This is what we've been talking about, that wisdom unfolds as compassion and exposes our false self, our false thinking. In this sense, then, this is kind of a sense of transcendent immanence, that which we know and which is real within ourselves and life are in and of themselves transcendent beyond us. Or perhaps using this expression, none other than this very self is exposed by that which is beyond the self. Okay, so again, speculation, but something that Daijok and I used to love to talk about, and this is just one example of that. And then I remembered this. I remember that I heard a Dharma talk given once by a Zen priest, and the priest said something like this. Imagine yourself sitting in a pitch black room. There's no light has entered that room for eons of time. Suddenly a curtain parts, allowing rays of light to pierce the darkness. Ordinarily, we would say that the light has entered the room and illuminated the darkness, and thus we see the light. But what does that really mean? The priest went on to say, in actuality, we are not really seeing the rays of light themselves. What we are seeing is the light reflecting off the dust floating in the room. So we're not seeing the light, we're seeing the light reflecting off of the dust. We're seeing the reflections of the light on the dust in the room. And so it might be true to say, because of the dust, we see the light. Might not this be a Zen perspective on this notion? Because of the dust, because of this self that is actualized within the myriad of all beings, and that falls away, we can see the light of emptiness. Just asking questions. I'm not a Zen specialist, but it's just fascinating to me. And so then I went on to think this. In contrast, might Shinran be teaching us this? Because of the light, we can see the dust. Not because of the dust we see the light, but because of the light we see the dust. I would like to suggest that Shin Buddhism offers a focus on a soteriology of transcendent immanence. Its formless Dharma body as suchness gives rise to Dharma body as compassion means. It manifests a form of light which exposes us in its wisdom illumination and takes the name Namo Amidabutsu, making itself known to us, enabling us to know ourselves and live authentic lives. Because of the light, we see the dust. Moreover, it seems to me that Shinran, who is a very much of a realist, I think, might now ask this age-old question, which was posed by Hamlet in this way. What a piece of work is a man? How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals, and yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? There may be some Shakespeare specialists out there, and if so, I apologize. I deliberately chose this version of this passage, which is very well known, Hamlet's soliloquy to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. I chose the version in Quarto 2 instead of Folio 1, and which many of you who are specialists realize that know that that's the one that's often cited. I like this version a lot. And it's one that I think Sir Kenneth Branagh used in his movie version of Hamlet. I like it because it says here, when it's talking about how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god. In other versions, it says how express and admirable in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, which to me seems a little odd. So I just chose this because I like the sound of it a lot more, and it seems to make a lot more sense to me because Hamlet is now, in a sense, comparing the ideal of existence, how like a god humans seem to be, and yet, what is this quintessence of dust? So these are words from his monologue at Act 2, Scene 1 of Shakespeare's play. He's lamenting to his old friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, about the wide disparity between the nobility of people believe themselves to possess and the base reality of the human heart and behavior. How like a god, he cries, and yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? What he seems to be asking to me, and I think what Shinran is also asking, is what does it mean to be a sentient being? Exposed within the illumination of wisdom light, do we simply recognize ourselves as dust? Because of the light, we see the dust. Is that where it ends? Albeit a kind of a fifth level element within our base and evil world. Is that all there is to Shinran's message to unenlightened beings? Is that where it ends? Or, and again, my suggestion, living within the world in front of the text, might Shinran be suggesting something paradoxically transformative and empowering? Might he be revealing that Amida Buddha as absolute other exposes and embraces the finitude and particularity of each being as other, and in that way Amida as other becomes absolute within the other's experience of being exposed as finite, imperfect, and evil, and thus embraced by the other? A lot of words, but this is my question. Perhaps within the activity of wisdom unfolding as compassion, it's not just we can see the dust because of the light, or we can see the light because of the dust. Maybe Shinran is offering a possibility that we can see it in both ways. There's a well-known passage from the Tannisho, the postscript, which I think speaks to that. Here, Shinran cries out from the particularity of his own existence of shame and gratitude for the compassionate activity of Amida's vow, which exposes and takes him in. It says, when I consider deeply the vow of Amida, which arose from 5 kalpas of profound thought, I realized that it was entirely for the sake of myself alone. Then how I am filled with gratitude for the primal vow in which Amida resolved to save me, though I am burdened with such heavy karma. I'm going to move on really quickly because we're really running out of time. Let me just say this. At this point, this is what I've learned in the world in front of Shinran's text. These are my conclusions. The Buddha's vow mind does not exist because we can prove it through logic or scientific observation, but because we hear its call, Namo Amidabutsu, and truly know it. It's not a matter of logic or scientific proof. Do we hear the call? The Buddha's wisdom light is not real because we can see it, but because we are exposed by it. We realize that we are known by it as it becomes us. Shinjin is not true because we seek and obtain it, but because we experience the embrace of the Buddha's compassionate heart. It seeks and finds us just as we are. During our lives, we may encounter many of the infinite and active forms that the vow mind may take. When that occurs, we may be exposed and emptied of our deluded thinking and the false claims of our egos. At those moments, there may arise the possibility of being able to know ourselves and live genuine lives, whereby we awaken to the reality of wisdom and compassion in all existences and find ourselves able to be participants in the activity of wisdom and compassion throughout our lives. Let me just give you a couple of examples, if I could. I'm going to skip this. This is more one of my philosophical musings. I'll jump over that. I'd like to conclude by introducing the art of two persons that to me manifest the activity of wisdom unfolding as compassion in ways that are vivid and deeply moving. Now, the first is a poem by Sakamura Shinmin, a Pure Land Buddhist and poet from Japan, who evokes the reality of compassion with delicate directness. Those of you who've heard my Dharma talks before have heard this. People from Berkeley have heard this many times. My apologies. I love this poem. The second is the art of Judith Scott, a woman with Down syndrome whose life and art gave expression to the transformative tension between entwinement and liberation. First, Sakamura. I can't see it on the top. It says, "I want to have arms." That's the name of the poem. It goes like this. In a picture entitled Mother, drawn by a child who could not see, she is portrayed as having many arms. As I gazed at that portrait, I clearly understood the reality of the thousand-armed Kannon. Since then, each one of her arms seems to have come fully alive. That strange figure is no longer strange at all, for it has taken on the image of truth. I also want to have 1,000 arms for the children in Vietnam and Pakistan, for the children in India and Nepal. I love this poem. It speaks to me differently every time I read it. The sense I get is here's Sakamura is looking at this portrait. And that you can see a portrait here that this is actually my own portrait that I made using the computer. But let's imagine that this was drawn by a child. I don't know if it's a boy or girl. Let's say a girl. And so this picture, this portrait entitled Mother, was drawn by a child who has visual limitations. I don't know if the child cannot see at all or has other visual impairments. But this child has drawn this mother in this way, having many, many arms. And Sakamura says he stared at this portrait many, many times. He thought it was strange, he says later on, very strange. But as he continued to stare at it and he began to think about it, he realized that what he was learning from this portrait, from this child, was the reality of the thousand-armed Kannon. A lot of you are familiar with that. This is an image of the thousand-armed Kannon, the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. This is one idea. This is one rendering of thousand-armed Kannon, Senju Kannon. You can see this Bodhisattva has many, many arms, maybe not 1,000, but many arms. And if you look at the arms or the hands are carrying various things: incense burner, wheel of Dharma, a book, sometimes a pen, maybe an arrow, a quiver, a bow and arrow. All sorts of items are held by the Bodhisattva, which indicates that compassion appears in many forms, in many guises, sometimes as a scholar, sometimes as a priest, sometimes as a spouse, sometimes by other people in life. Many times it's difficult. Maybe tough love is the best way to introduce compassion. So compassion appears in many guises, affects us in a variety of ways throughout our lives. That's the nature of the thousand-armed Kannon. And Sakamura says, when I saw this portrait drawn by this child, finally, this child taught me about the thousand-armed Kannon. Now I understand. And he says, as I continue to look at this portrait, each one of her arms seems to come fully alive. Because what we are seeing now is a child with visual impairments who is being cared for daily by her mother, a mother who helps to get her ready for school maybe picks out her clothes, helps her get dressed, makes breakfast for her, makes sure that she gets to school okay, welcomes her back, helps to prepare dinner, helps her with her homework, etc. The mother for the child has many arms, 1,000 arms, hands of compassion in a variety of guises, in a variety of forms. And of course, then she would draw her mother with many arms. And of course, then Sakamura would say, this is the meaning of the 1,000-arm Kannon. And as he continues to look at this portrait drawn by the child, he says, that strange figure is no longer strange at all, for it has taken on the image of truth. And then he says, I also want to have 1,000 arms for the children in Vietnam and Pakistan, for the children in India and Nepal. This is reality now that this child's portrait has awakened me to. And I would like to have arms. I would like to have 1,000 arms to reach out, to provide help and support and sustenance to so many people in need. It's a beautiful, beautiful poem. I just, one of my favorite poems. And one of the other things about this is that it's said that in Japan in particular, this Avalokitesvara, Kannon Bodhisattva, has a particular resonance for people with visual impairments. And it could well be because of this. You can see at the head of the Bodhisattva, the Bodhisattva wearing a crown. And on the crown, on the crown, there are many faces, many eyes. And the Bodhisattva is looking out 360 degrees around the world to perceive the sounds of the world. Okay. The Bodhisattva perceives the cries of suffering, of need and people throughout the world, and is able to respond with a variety of hands of compassion, arms of compassion. I'd like now to move on to my final representation. This is about a woman by the name of Judith Scott. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Judith, but Judith, as you can see, was born in 1943 and she passed away in 2005. Judith had Down syndrome. And at a time when she was born in Ohio. It was a very difficult time to be a person with cognitive delays. She lived with her family for a short period of time. She had a twin sister and some brothers. But when she was young, she experienced a hearing loss, which was unknown to anyone. It was completely undiagnosed. And people just thought that she's not able to function at all. She's just mentally retarded. And so she was placed in an institution at the age of 5. And there she remained by herself, alone and lost, for 35 years. But later on, her twin sister Joyce found her and got her out of the institution and brought her to live with her in the Bay Area. And at the age of 44, Judith finally had a chance to express her thoughts and her feelings through her art at the Creative Growth Arts Center in Oakland, California. Judith was a specialist in what's called found art. She would find various items just left over or discarded on the street, and she would wrap them. She would find objects, or she would find string or yarn, and she'd tie them together, and she would put them together, rolling them together with this twine over and over again to create objects of art. It's said, this is, I learned about Judith through a film created by a woman by the name of Betsy Baya. In the film, it's said that Judith Scott was extolled for being an expert in something called outsider art, which is a sense of creativity by persons who are on the fringes of society, who don't have any wish to follow artistic fads or receive wealth or fame. They just do it for the pure joy, the need to create art. But more than that, I think more than that, to me, the art of Judith Scott speaks to me. As many of you know, my son David has Down syndrome. And I just reflect upon him as well when I see these works of art, because they tell me this, that Judith Scott was doing her art because that's who she was. She was expressing herself and her life. She was lost for 35 years, She was discarded for 35 years until she was found by her sister. And so she spent the rest of her life finding and rescuing lost items. She would go out into the street to find things that had been thrown away, that were worthless and valueless. Things like old CDs you can see here, or pieces of wire or twine or string or yarn. And she would tie them together and wrap them carefully and lovingly to create these objects of art, in which she would now present to the world herself in the way that she knew, because this is what she knew, that she was lost, she was discarded, and she was found. Somehow, we so-called normal people, we have a hard time recognizing humanness in others. We make assumptions about ourselves. We're so able, we're better. People don't talk like us, or they don't walk like us, or think like us. If they express themselves in ways different from us, we don't think of them as normal. We're the humans. They're the outsiders. They're the poor, the immigrants, the uneducated, the disabled, the retarded, the outcasts. This is how we are. But sometimes, every now and then, it takes a deceptively simple work of outsider art, an odd shape wrapped in yarn or a ball of twine, to make us see all of us, that all of us are really, we're all just balls of twine. Each person and experience that we meet in life is another piece of yarn or twine that we find. With it, it creates our own unique shape, our own color and character. No one is better or more valuable than anyone else. Each of us is simply the product and the process of entwinement, which connects us all to the rest of life and makes us complete. In the life and art of Judith Scott, we find expressed a beauty of entwinement and interconnectedness of life. She found these items that were discarded, and she gave them connection. She gave them beauty. This is the sense of entwinement and interconnectedness that we all share, allows us to realize the infinite value and promise of our humanness and realize ultimate liberation. We're emptied of our false claims to independence, agency, omnipotence, or ableness. We're embraced and never abandoned by the wisdom light, and we're now enabled to live genuinely as unique individuals within a universe of connection with other genuine, unique individuals. So this is what Shinran's thought signifies to me. This is what I learned from the world in front of the text. And we're exposed and emptied by the Buddha's vow mind, the activity of wisdom unfolding as compassion. And yet at the same time, we're embraced and enabled to live our individual and our communal lives so that we can seek to take the Buddha's vows as our own and practice compassion with a deep sense of interconnectedness and a gratitude for all existences. Thank you very much. This ends my talks. I wonder if I can ask you to join me in Gassho. Namo Amidabutsu. Namo Amidabutsu. Namo Amidabutsu. Namo Amidabutsu.